Hey there, magnificent rebels of the galaxy. Before we dive into today's absolutely legendary story about what happens when unstoppable human independence meets immovable galactic bureaucracy, I need to know something incredible about you incredible beings. Drop a comment right now and tell me, what's the most beautifully rebellious thing you've ever done? Did you ignore a stupid rule that made no sense? Did you help someone cut through red tape to get something important done? Or did you just flat out refuse to ask permission for something you had every right to do? And listen carefully, my fellow freedom fighters. If this tale of humans casually dismantling the galaxy's most oppressive bureaucracy while drinking coffee and being politely defiant gets your rebellious spirit soaring, absolutely demolish that like button. Because today's story is going to show you exactly why the phrase, "you need permission for that," is the most dangerous thing you can say to a human. We don't ask for permission to breathe. We don't ask for permission to exist. And we sure as hell don't ask for permission to do what's right. Picture this, my magnificent anarchists of awesomeness, an ancient galactic bureaucracy that has controlled every aspect of civilized life for over 10,000 years. A system so complex that you need permits to get permits. A government so vast that some departments exist solely to create paperwork for other departments. Citizens spend their entire lives filling out forms, waiting in lines, and asking permission for everything from changing careers to having children to thinking unapproved thoughts. And then they discovered humans. Beautiful, chaotic, wonderfully ungovernable humans who looked at a 10,000-year-old system of absolute administrative control and said, "That's nice, we'll be over here doing things." They expected us to integrate into their system, to follow their procedures, to ask permission for our existence. They were about to learn that humans don't just ignore bureaucracy. We accidentally destroy it by the simple act of being ourselves. Today's story is about the day the galaxy's most powerful government discovered that there's one force in the universe that no amount of paperwork can control: human beings who have decided they're going to do something and don't particularly care what anyone else thinks about it. So grab your favorite beverage of rebellion, whether that's coffee strong enough to wake the dead, tea that refuses to follow proper steeping procedures, or whatever your species drinks when they're planning to cheerfully ignore authority, and let me tell you about the day humanity accidentally liberated an entire galaxy. By refusing to fill out the proper forms, the Galactic Administrative Council had achieved something that no government in the history of the universe had ever accomplished: perfect control through perfect bureaucracy. For 10,347 standard galactic years, they had regulated every aspect of life for 734 different species across 42,000 inhabited worlds. Not through force, not through fear, but through the simple expedient of making everything require proper paperwork. Want to travel between star systems? Form 47B, stamped by your local transportation authority, countersigned by your destination's immigration office, and approved by the Intersystem Transit Commission. Planning to start a business? That'll require permits from the Commercial Licensing Bureau, the Economic Impact Assessment Division, the Workplace Safety Administration, and the Department of Ensuring People Don't Do Things Without Permission. Having a baby? Better file Form 12C for reproductive intent, Form 15D for genetic compatibility verification, and Form 23A for parental fitness evaluation. The system was perfect. Absolutely, utterly, mathematically perfect. Every citizen in the galaxy knew their place because their place was defined by their permit status. Every activity was regulated because unregulated activity was, by definition, illegal. Every problem was solved by creating a new department to issue permits for dealing with that specific type of problem. It was civilization through administration, order through obstruction, and peace through paperwork. Administrator Prime Zeftal stood in the central command chamber of the Administrative Nexus, a space station the size of a small moon that existed solely to house the bureaucratic apparatus necessary to govern galactic civilization. Around him, thousands of clerks, secretaries, filing specialists, and permit processors worked with quiet efficiency at desks that stretched from floor to ceiling in perfect geometric arrays. The soft sound of stamping, typing, and form filling created a symphony of administrative harmony that had remained unchanged for millennia. Zeftal himself was the perfect product of the perfect system. Born into a family of mid-level administrators, educated at the Galactic Academy of Proper Procedures, and promoted through the ranks based on his exceptional ability to create paperwork that required other paperwork to be properly processed. He stood 7 feet tall, his pale blue skin marked with the ritual scars that indicated his certification in advanced bureaucratic theory, his 3 arms allowing him to process forms at superhuman speed while his cybernetic implants gave him perfect recall of every regulation in the administrative code. He was reviewing the daily productivity reports when his assistant, a nervous Zilonian named Crixol, approached his desk with what appeared to be a new file. "Administrator Prime," Crixol said, his 4 eyes blinking in the pattern that indicated administrative confusion, "we have a ... situation." Zeftal didn't look up from his reports. Situations were common in galactic administration. Usually they involved someone filing the wrong form or failing to get proper approval for filing a form or requesting permission to request permission incorrectly. All easily solved by directing the offender to the appropriate department. "Define the situation," he said, his pen continuing to move across the approval documents with mechanical precision. "Sir, we've discovered a new species. They call themselves humans. They originate from a planet in the Outer Rim territories that wasn't included in our latest census." Zeftal paused. New species were always exciting from an administrative perspective. It meant new categories of permits, new departments to create, new regulations to implement. Excellent. Have they submitted their species integration request forms? Crixol's eye blinking accelerated to what Zeftal recognized as the pattern indicating bureaucratic distress. "Sir, that's the situation. They haven't submitted any forms. I don't understand. They haven't submitted their integration paperwork yet. How long have we been in contact?" "Sir, we've been observing them for 3 standard months. They're aware of our existence. They've been contacted by our integration specialists. They've been provided with the complete new species administrative package." Zeftal finally looked up from his paperwork. In 10,000 years of galactic administration, no species had ever taken more than 6 standard weeks to begin the integration process. Most submitted their initial paperwork within days of first contact, eager to join the civilized galaxy and begin the orderly process of regulatory compliance. Perhaps they're having difficulty understanding the forms? Some primitive species struggle with advanced administrative concepts. "Sir," Crixol said carefully, "they understood the forms perfectly. They read through the entire 40-7-1000 page integration package in less than a day. And they said, and I quote, 'Thanks, this is very thorough. We'll get back to you on this.' When? Sir, when will they get back to us?" Crixol's eye blinking reached what Zeftal recognized as the pattern for administrative impossibility encountered. "Sir, they didn't say they just ... went back to what they were doing." For the first time in his administrative career, Zeftal encountered a situation that didn't fit into any of the established categories for bureaucratic problems. What ... What were they doing? "Sir, they appear to be expanding across multiple star systems without proper authorization." They've established colonies on 17 different worlds without filing environmental impact assessments. They're engaged in interstellar commerce without commercial activity permits. They're terraforming planets without ecosystem modification licenses. Zeftal's 3 hands stopped moving simultaneously. That's impossible. You can't do those things without permits. Yes, sir. That's what our integration specialists told them. And the human said, "Watch us." The silence that followed was unlike anything that had ever existed in the administrative nexus. For 10,000 years, the soft sounds of bureaucratic activity had continued without interruption. Now for the first time in recorded history, the administrative machinery of galactic civilization paused in confusion. "Sir," Crixel continued, "there's more. They're not just ignoring our permit requirements. They single quotes . They're helping other species do the same." Zeftal felt something that no Administrator Prime had ever experienced. The sensation of the perfect system encountering an imperfection it couldn't categorize. "Explain?" "Sir, we've received reports from 17 different sectors. Species that have been properly integrated into our administrative framework for centuries are suddenly stopping." "Stopping what?" "Everything, sir. They're not filing their regular compliance reports. They're not renewing their activity permits. They're not requesting permission for new initiatives. When our field administrators ask them about their non-compliance, they say they're trying the human approach." Zeftal's cybernetic implants began running diagnostic programs, searching for any precedent in the administrative code for a situation like this. The results came back negative. In 10,000 years of galactic administration, no situation had ever arisen where a species simply ignored the entire regulatory framework. "Have we explained to them that activities without proper permits are illegal?" "Yes, sir. Multiple times, and they asked us what we were going to do about it." Zeftal's diagnostic programs crashed. The question, "What are you going to do about it?" wasn't covered by any section of the administrative code. The entire system was built on the assumption that rational beings would naturally want to comply with proper procedures. The concept of deliberate, cheerful non-compliance was literally incomprehensible. "Sir," Crixel added, "the integration specialists are requesting guidance. The humans have invited them to hang out and see how things work on their colonies. Several of our personnel have submitted requests for extended observation assignments. They say the human approach to problem solving is refreshing." The word refreshing hit Zeftal like a physical blow. Nothing about proper administration should be refreshing. Proper administration should be orderly, predictable, and thoroughly documented. Refreshing implied change, spontaneity, and deviation from established procedures. "Sir," Crixel continued, "I should also mention that the humans have been sending U.S. gifts." "Gifts?" "Yes, sir. Food items, cultural artifacts, and something they call coffee. They've also submitted several forms." For a moment, Zeftal felt relief. Finally, the humans were engaging with proper bureaucratic procedures. "What forms have they submitted?" Crixel handed him a datapad. Zeftal activated it and immediately felt his orderly world tilt sideways. Forms were legitimate administrative council paperwork filled out with perfect bureaucratic accuracy. But the requests were ... impossible. Application for permission to ignore permissions. Request for approval to disapprove of approval processes. Permit application for operating without permits. License request for unlicensed activities. Each form was completed correctly, signed properly, and submitted through appropriate channels. They were also completely absurd. "Sir," Crixel said. Quietly, They've submitted over 3,000 similar forms. Our processing department is ... confused. Zeftal scrolled through the applications. Request for authorization to be unauthorized. Permit for unpermitted existence. License for unlicensed living. Application for permission to question the need. For applications. Each one was bureaucratically perfect and philosophically impossible. They're mocking us, he realized. Sir, they're using our own system against us. They're following proper procedures to request permission to ignore proper procedures. Zeftal's administrative training kicked in. When faced with an impossible situation, the proper response was to create a new department to handle that specific type of impossibility. Very well. Issue a priority administrative alert. We're implementing Emergency Protocol 7. Sir, what's Emergency Protocol 7? We're going to demonstrate to these humans why 10,000 years of galactic civilization has functioned on the principle of proper administrative oversight. Prepare the compliance fleet. Emergency Protocol 7 had never been used in the history of galactic administration. It had been created as a theoretical response to the hypothetical situation of a species completely ignoring the regulatory framework. Most administrative theorists had considered it an academic exercise, since no rational species would ever deliberately choose chaos over order. The compliance fleet consisted of 50 administrative vessels, each one a mobile bureaucracy capable of processing permits, conducting inspections, and ensuring regulatory compliance across entire star systems. They were staffed by the galaxy's most experienced administrators, auditors, and compliance specialists. It was overwhelming bureaucratic force designed to bring even the most disorganized society into line with proper procedures. Administrator Prime Zeftal personally led the fleet to human space, confident that a demonstration of proper administrative authority would quickly resolve the situation. The humans had clearly never encountered truly professional bureaucracy. Once they saw the efficiency and power of the galactic regulatory system, they would naturally want to comply. The fleet arrived at the edge of human space to find 17 human colonies spread across 12 different star systems, all operating without a single permit between them. It was the most beautiful display of organized chaos that Zeftal had ever seen. Cities built without urban planning permits. Terraforming projects conducted without environmental approval. Space stations constructed without safety inspections. It should have been a disaster. Instead, it was working perfectly. Sir, reported Chief Compliance Officer Naltek, preliminary scans show that human operations are actually exceeding galactic standards for efficiency, safety, and environmental protection. That's impossible. You can't exceed galactic standards without following galactic procedures. Yes, sir. But they're doing it anyway. The first human ship to approach the compliance fleet was small, unmarked, and completely lacking in any of the identification symbols required by galactic transportation. Regulation 45C. It should have been immediately impounded for regulatory violations. Instead, it transmitted a cheerful greeting. Hey there. Welcome to human space. I'm Captain Riley Santos. You folks look like you could use some coffee. Want to come aboard and chat? Chief Compliance Officer Naltek turned to Zeftal in confusion. Sir, they're inviting us aboard their vessel. But they haven't submitted a diplomatic contact request form or obtained a foreign visitor permit. Inform them of the proper procedures, Zeftal ordered. Sir, we did. They said, paperwork's boring. Let's just talk like normal people. For the second time in his career, Zeftal encountered a situation not covered by the administrative code. Normal people didn't exist in galactic civilization. There were citizens, Permit Class A, residents. Permit Class B, visitors, Permit Class C, and unprocessed biological entities, Permit Class Pending. Nobody was just normal. "Sir," Captain Santos's voice came over the communication channel, "we've got fresh coffee, homemade cookies, and a really interesting story about how we accidentally terraformed the moon by trying to grow tomatoes. You sure you don't want to come over?" Against every instinct of his administrative training, Zeftal found himself curious. How did one accidentally terraform a moon? What regulatory framework allowed for accidental planetary modification? "Very well," he decided. "We'll conduct an informal inspection of your vessel." "Awesome," Santos replied. "Fair warning, though, we're not really set up for formal inspections. Everything here pretty much runs on the if it works, don't fix it principle." The docking procedure was the first sign that humans operated by completely different rules. Standard galactic protocol required 17 different safety checks, 6 different authorization confirmations, and 3 different contamination scans before 2 vessels could dock. The humans simply extended a docking tube and said, "Come on over." When Zeftal pointed out the safety violations, Captain Santos shrugged and said, "We've been doing this for years. Haven't lost anyone yet." The interior of the human ship was a revelation in controlled chaos. Nothing was where galactic regulations said it should be. The command center was combined with what appeared to be a kitchen. The navigation station had someone's coffee cup sitting on it. The safety equipment was scattered throughout the ship. Instead of being properly secured in designated safety equipment storage areas, through F it should have been a disaster. Instead, it was the most efficiently run vessel Zeftal had ever seen. "Coffee?" Captain Santos offered, pouring a dark liquid from a device that definitely wasn't approved by the Galactic Food Safety Administration. "It's good stuff. We grow it on a planet that officially doesn't exist because we forgot to file the planetary Discovery Report." Zeftal accepted the coffee out of diplomatic necessity and immediately understood why humans were so dangerously unbureaucratic. The beverage was delicious, energizing, and completely unregulated. It was liquid freedom. "Captain Santos," he said carefully, "your operations appear to be functional, but you must understand that proper procedures exist for good reasons. Safety, efficiency, preventing conflicts between species." Santos nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, we figured. That's why we do things the way that actually works instead of the way the paperwork says we should do them. But without proper oversight, how do you ensure compliance with safety standards?" "Well," Santos said, gesturing, "around the ship, we don't comply with safety standards. We exceed them. See, when you're responsible for keeping people alive in space, you don't have time to file forms about it. You just have to make sure it works." Zeftal's administrative training struggled with the concept. But how do you document your procedures? How do you ensure consistency across different operations? How do you prevent unauthorized personnel from making unauthorized modifications? Santos laughed, a sound that was somehow both respectful and completely dismissive of everything Zeftal represented. "Administrator, can I show you something?" He led Zeftal to the ship's engineering section, where a young human woman was casually modifying what appeared to be the primary life support system while humming a tune. "This is Engineer Martinez. Martinez, tell the administrator about your qualifications." "Oh, hey," Martinez said cheerfully, not stopping her work. "I don't have any official qualifications. I just really like figuring out how things work and making them work better. Last week, I redesigned our oxygen recycler to run 30% more efficiently. This week, I'm working on making it also produce coffee flavor enhancers." Zeftal felt his worldview cracking. "She's modifying critical life support systems without proper certification?" "Yep," Santos confirmed. "And she's the best engineer we've ever had." Turns out when people are free to experiment and innovate instead of following predetermined procedures, they come up with amazing solutions. But what if she makes a mistake? What if her modifications cause system failures? What if? Then we'll fix it, Martinez interrupted, looking up from her work with a smile. That's what engineers do. We solve problems. We don't ask permission to solve problems. We just solve them. The tour continued for 3 hours, during which Zeftal observed humans running a complex interstellar operation with no permits, no regulatory oversight, and no apparent regard for proper procedures. They grew food without agricultural licenses, conducted scientific research without research permits, and traded with other species without commercial activity authorizations, and it was working better than any regulated operation Zeftal had ever seen. Captain Santos, he said finally, I must ask directly, why don't you simply apply for proper permits? It would legitimize your operations and bring you into compliance with galactic law. Santos considered the question seriously. Administrator, can I ask you something in return? Proceed. How long does it take to get a permit to start a new agricultural project? Zeftal's implants immediately accessed the relevant information. A Class C agricultural development permit requires initial application processing 6 weeks, environmental impact assessment 12 weeks, soil compatibility verification 8 weeks, genetic modification approval 15 weeks, water rights confirmation 10 weeks, and final compliance inspection 4 weeks. Total processing time 55 weeks, assuming no complications or appeals. 55 weeks, Santos repeated. Administrator, last month our colony on Kepler 442b was facing food shortages due to a crop disease. Using your system, we would have filed paperwork for 55 weeks while people went hungry. Instead, engineer Martinez designed a new hydroponics system in 3 days. We had it running in a week, and we were producing surplus food in a month. But what about safety checks, environmental protection, genetic stability? We handled all of that, Santos said. We just didn't ask permission. First, we checked safety as we went. We monitored environmental impact in real time. We tested genetic stability continuously. We did everything your system does, but we did it while actually solving the problem instead of documenting our intent to solve the problem. Zeftal felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding of how civilization should work. But without central oversight, how do you prevent conflicts? How do you ensure fair distribution of resources? How do you maintain order? Santos smiled, and for the first time, Zeftal understood that it wasn't a mocking smile. It was the smile of someone who genuinely cared about the questions being asked. Administrator, we prevent conflicts by talking to each other. We ensure fair distribution by sharing with people who need things. We maintain order by taking responsibility for our actions instead of hiding behind regulations. And if someone abuses that freedom, if someone takes advantage of the lack of oversight, then we deal with them, Martinez called out from her workstation. Not by filing complaints and waiting for bureaucrats to handle it. We deal with problems when they happen, where they happen, with the people who are actually involved. Zeftal's 3 hands began moving automatically, reaching for forms that weren't there. His training demanded that he document this conversation, file reports, and initiate proper procedures for handling administrative code violations. But looking around the ship, seeing humans solving problems faster than he could have documented them, he began to understand something revolutionary. Maybe the problems weren't being solved despite the lack of bureaucracy. Maybe they were being solved because of the lack of bureaucracy. Captain Santos, he said slowly, your people seem to be happy. Yeah, we are, Santos confirmed. Turns out when you're free to work on things you care about, when you can make decisions without asking permission from 17 different departments, when you can help people without filing impact assessments first, life gets pretty good. But surely you must have some form of government, some system of laws and regulations? Oh, we have laws, Santos said. Don't hurt people. Don't take stuff that doesn't belong to you. Help out when you can. Fix problems. When you find them, they're pretty simple. Zeftal's administrative training recoiled. That's not nearly comprehensive enough. What about commercial regulations? Transportation safety, environmental protection, cultural preservation, economic stability? We handle all that stuff, Martinez said, looking up from a device that was now apparently producing both oxygen and coffee-scented air. We just handle it by doing it, not by regulating it. Santos nodded. Administrator, I think the question isn't whether our system works. I think the question is whether your system is actually helping people or just keeping them busy. The return. Trip to the compliance fleet was the longest journey of Zeftal's life. Everything he had seen aboard the human ship contradicted everything he had been taught about civilization, order, and proper governance. Yet he couldn't deny that it worked. The humans were healthy, productive, innovative, and happy. Their technology was advanced, their society was stable, and their operations were more efficient than anything in the regulated galaxy. Sir, Chief Compliance Officer Naltek greeted him as he returned to the flagship. How did the inspection proceed? Did you identify the regulatory violations? Are we prepared to initiate enforcement procedures? Zeftal stood in the command center of his ship, surrounded by perfectly organized bureaucrats following perfectly documented procedures. To maintain perfect regulatory compliance, and for the first time in his life, wondered if perfection was actually the problem. Naltek, he said slowly, how many forms did you process today? Today? Standard daily quota, sir. 437 permit applications, 62 compliance reports, and 115 regulatory modification requests. And how many problems did you solve? The question seemed to confuse his subordinate. Sir, I don't understand. I processed the paperwork related to problem-solving activities. The actual problem-solving is handled by the designated problem-solving departments after they receive proper authorization through the Problem-Solving Authorization Bureau. How long does that take? Standard processing time for problem-solving. Authorization is 6 weeks, assuming proper documentation and no appeals. Zeftal thought about Engineer Martinez redesigning life support systems in 3 days while humming a tune. Naltek, what happens if there's an emergency? If people need help immediately? Emergency situations are handled through emergency protocol authorization, which can be expedited to 48 hours if properly justified through the Emergency Justification Committee. 48 hours. Captain Santos had mentioned that humans dealt with problems when they happened, where they happened, with the people who were actually involved. Sir, Naltek continued, what are your orders regarding the human regulatory violations? Zeftal looked out at the human colonies where people were building, growing, exploring, and creating without asking anyone's permission. Then he looked around his ship where people were documenting, filing, processing, and authorizing without actually helping anyone. New orders, he said quietly. We're implementing a new protocol. Sir, we're going to observe human operations for an extended period. Full cultural immersion. I want our people to see how problems are solved without proper procedures. Naltek's expression showed pure bureaucratic panic. Sir, extended observation requires authorization for extended observation, which must be approved by the Extended Observation Authorization Committee, which requires Naltek. Zeftal interrupted and his subordinate immediately fell silent. In 10,000 years of galactic administration, no Administrator Prime had ever interrupted a procedure citation. What if we just observed them without asking permission? The silence that followed was so profound that Zeftal could hear the quiet hum of the ship's air recycling systems that had been designed by committees, approved by boards, and regulated by departments. Systems that worked, but probably not as well as they could if someone like Engineer Martinez had been free to improve them. "Sir," Naltec whispered, "that would be unauthorized." "Yes," Zeftal agreed. "Yes, it would be." And for the first time in his administrative career, he found that prospect exciting rather than terrifying. What followed was the most comprehensive, unofficial study in galactic history. For 6 months, teams of administrators, compliance officers, and regulatory specialists lived and worked alongside humans, observing their methods and gradually learning to solve problems instead of documenting them. The transformation was remarkable. Chief Compliance Officer Naltec, who had spent 30 years processing environmental impact assessments, learned to conduct real-time environmental monitoring while helping humans establish a new colony. He discovered that it was faster, more accurate, and infinitely more satisfying than filing reports about monitoring that someone else might eventually conduct. Administrative Specialist Crixel, who had specialized in commercial activity permits, learned to facilitate actual trade negotiations between species, instead of authorizing their intent to consider the possibility of trade. She found that when people were free to make deals that worked for everyone involved, commerce flourished beyond anything the regulated system had achieved. Safety Inspector Vorthak, who had spent decades filing safety violation reports, learned to work directly with engineers to identify and fix safety problems in real time. He was amazed to discover that people actually wanted to be safe and would eagerly implement improvements when they didn't have to wait months for authorization to protect themselves. But the most remarkable transformation was in Administrator Prime Zeftal himself. For the first time in his life, he experienced the satisfaction of directly helping people instead of processing requests for authorization to help people. When a human colony faced a medical emergency, he didn't initiate emergency medical authorization procedures. He helped coordinate the response. When two species had a trade dispute, he didn't refer them to the Interspecies Commerce Mediation Bureau. He helped them work it out. It was everything he had been trained to believe was impossible. It was chaotic, unregulated, completely outside the proper procedures. It was also the most fulfilling work he had ever done. "Administrator, Captain," Santos said one day as they worked together to resolve a resource shortage on one of the newer colonies, "you've been here 6 months now. What do you think of our approach?" Zeftal paused in his work of coordinating supply shipments, work that should have required transport authorization, resource allocation permits, and interstate commerce approvals, but which they had simply done because people needed supplies. "Captain, I think I'm beginning to understand something about the difference between managing people and serving them." "Oh?" "For 10,000 years, we've been managing galactic civilization, creating rules for how people should live, procedures for how they should work, requirements for how they should solve problems. We thought we were maintaining order." Santos nodded thoughtfully. "And now? Now I think we were just getting in the way." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from the administrative nexus. Zeftal's superior, Grand Administrator Vexthalen, appeared on the holographic display with an expression of bureaucratic fury that would have terrified any proper administrator. "Zeftal," he bellowed, his 3 arms gesturing wildly, "what is the meaning of this unauthorized extended observation? You were supposed to bring the humans into regulatory compliance, not disappear into their chaos." "Grand Administrator, Zeftal replied calmly, I'm submitting my report on human operational methods. I think you'll find the results interesting. Report? You haven't filed a single official document in 6 months. You've missed every deadline, ignored every protocol, and completely abandoned proper administrative procedure. Zeftal looked around at the colony where humans and aliens worked together to solve problems without asking permission, where innovation flourished without regulatory approval, where people helped each other without filing impact assessments first. Yes, he said simply. I have. This is unacceptable. You will return to the administrative nexus immediately and face disciplinary action for gross violations of administrative protocol. Grand Administrator, Zeftal said, and his voice carried a confidence that no amount of bureaucratic training had ever given him. I formally decline. The holographic display flickered as if the communication system itself was struggling to process such an unprecedented response. You decline? You can't decline a direct administrative order. Actually, Zeftal said, I can. I'm resigning from the Administrative Council, effective immediately. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Grand Administrator Vex Thalen's 3 arms hitting his desk simultaneously. You can't resign. Resignation requires proper documentation. You need to file intent to resign forms, undergo administrative separation procedures, and obtain authorization for post-administrative employment. Grand Administrator, Zeftal said with a smile that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. I've learned something important during my time with the humans. You can't regulate someone who doesn't acknowledge your authority to regulate them. That's chaos. That's anarchy. That's the end of civilization as we know it. Zeftal looked around again at the thriving colony, at aliens and humans, working together with unprecedented efficiency and satisfaction at problems being solved faster than they could be documented. Grand Administrator, he said, maybe it's time for civilization as we know it to end. The communication cut off, leaving Zeftal standing in a place where people were free to work, free to innovate, free to help each other, and free to live without asking permission for their existence. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was everything he had never known he wanted. The news of Administrator Prime Zeftal's resignation spread through the galaxy faster than any official communication network could have carried it. Within weeks, similar resignations began occurring throughout the Administrative Council. Compliance officers who had discovered the satisfaction of actually helping ensure compliance. Safety inspectors who had learned that safety was better achieved through cooperation than regulation. Permit processors who had found that most activities didn't actually need permits. The bureaucratic rebellion spread like wildfire through a system that had never been designed to handle the concept of people simply walking away from authority. Entire departments found themselves without staff as administrators chose to work directly with the people they had previously regulated. Whole sectors declared themselves permit-free zones and began operating on human principles of voluntary cooperation and direct problem-solving. The administrative nexus, that massive space station dedicated to governing galactic civilization, found itself in the unprecedented position of having no one to govern. The remaining administrators tried desperately to maintain order through emergency regulations, special authorizations, and crisis management protocols. But it's difficult to regulate people who have stopped acknowledging your authority to regulate them. Grand Administrator Vex Thalen, now presiding over a bureaucracy that was hemorrhaging personnel faster than it could process resignation forms, made one final attempt to restore order. He sent a massive enforcement fleet to human space, with orders to arrest the ringleaders of galactic insurrection and restore proper administrative authority. The fleet arrived to find representatives from over 200 species waiting for them, not with weapons or threats, but with welcome packages, coffee, and invitations to see how things worked when people were free to solve problems instead of documenting them. The fleet commanders, faced with the choice between firing on unarmed civilians or accepting hospitality from people who were clearly not the dangerous anarchists they had been told to expect, chose to accept the coffee. Within hours, the enforcement fleet had become an observation fleet. Within days, they were participating in the cooperative governance model that had evolved in human space. Within weeks, they were sending messages back to the administrative nexus, explaining that they had found a better way to maintain order. By helping people instead of regulating them, the final blow to the galactic bureaucracy came when the humans submitted one last set of forms to the Administrative Council. It was a complete audit of the Administrative Council itself, conducted with the same cheerful thoroughness that humans brought to everything they did. The audit revealed what no one had ever bothered to check. The Administrative Council itself had never filed the proper paperwork to authorize its own existence. For 10,000 years, the galaxy's most powerful bureaucracy had been operating without the permits it required everyone else to obtain. The irony was so profound that it achieved something no military force or revolutionary movement had ever accomplished. It made the entire concept of bureaucratic authority laughable. Grand Administrator Vexthylan, faced with the choice of either shutting down the Administrative Council for operating without proper authorization or admitting that proper authorization was meaningless, chose a third option. He applied for a job with the Human Cooperative Governance Initiative, which had been established to help former administrators learn how to work productively instead of bureaucratically. The transition wasn't easy. 10,000 years of regulatory thinking couldn't be changed overnight. Many former administrators struggled with the concept of solving problems without first creating committees to study the problems. Others had difficulty accepting that most activities didn't require oversight from beings who had never actually performed those activities, but gradually, with patience and plenty of coffee, the former bureaucrats learned to contribute instead of regulate. They discovered that their organizational skills were valuable when applied to actually organizing things, instead of organizing the documentation of things. They found that their attention to detail was appreciated when used to improve processes instead of complicating them. Most importantly, they learned what the humans had known all along, that people generally wanted to do good work, help their communities, and solve problems. They just needed to be free to do those things without asking permission first. 3 years after the great bureaucratic dissolution, the galaxy was unrecognizable. Where once there had been 42,000 regulated worlds, there were now countless cooperative communities working together by choice rather than mandate. Trade flourished because people were free to make deals that actually worked. Innovation exploded because inventors didn't need approval to invent. Art and culture bloomed because creativity couldn't be regulated. Former administrator Prime Zeftal, now simply Zeftal, coordinator of the Voluntary Assistance Network, stood in what had once been the administrative nexus. The massive space station had been converted into a resource center where anyone could come for help, advice, or simply a good cup of coffee and conversation. The endless rows of bureaucratic workstations had been replaced with comfortable meeting areas, workshops, and laboratories where people from across the galaxy collaborated on projects they cared about. Zeftal called a familiar voice. He turned to see Captain Santos approaching, now Admiral Santos in the loosest possible sense. The humans had reluctantly accepted the need for some coordination between their growing network of cooperative worlds, but they had insisted on keeping it as simple as possible. Santos's rank mainly meant that other people asked his opinion more often and expected him to keep track of who was good at solving which kinds of problems. "Admiral," Zeftal replied, still getting used to the informality that had replaced rigid hierarchical protocols. "How are the integration programs proceeding?" Santos grinned. "You mean how are the former bureaucrats adjusting to actually getting things done? Pretty well, actually. Though we did have an incident yesterday." "Oh? Yeah, a group of former permit processing specialists got so excited about directly solving a trade dispute that they worked for 18 hours straight without filing a single report about it. We had to remind them that they were allowed to take breaks." Zeftal laughed, a sound that still felt strange after decades of administrative solemnity. "The enthusiasm is infectious. Former Chief Compliance Officer Naltak has become quite famous for his environmental restoration projects." "That's the thing about people," Santos said, settling into one of the comfortable chairs that had replaced the formal administrative seating. "When you free them to work on things they care about, they tend to exceed everyone's expectations, including their own." They were interrupted by an alert from the communication center. A young human technician approached them with a data pad. "Admiral, Coordinator, we're receiving a priority transmission from the Outer Rim territories. Apparently, there's a situation developing with a species called the hegemony." Santos and Zeftal exchanged glances. The Outer Rim was still largely unexplored, and first contact situations required careful handling. "What kind of situation?" Santos asked. The technician consulted her pad. "Well, the hegemony appears to be a militaristic empire that's been expanding through conquest. They've encountered some of our cooperative settlements and are confused." "Confused how?" "They keep demanding to speak to our leaders, and our people keep telling them that they don't have leaders in the traditional sense. The hegemony representatives are having difficulty understanding how a civilization can function without central authority." Zeftal felt a familiar stirring of excitement. "Another bureaucracy?" "Worse," the technician replied. "Pure military hierarchy. Everything organized around chain of command, absolute obedience, and territorial control. They've conquered 47 star systems through superior force and administrative efficiency." Santos stood up with the expression Zeftal had learned to recognize as human about to solve a problem that everyone else considered unsolvable. "Well," Santos said, "I suppose someone should go explain to them how voluntary cooperation works." "Admiral," Zeftal said carefully, "the hegemony has conquered 47 star systems. They might not be receptive to alternative governmental philosophies." "That's exactly why they need to hear about them," Santos replied. "Besides, we're not going to fight them. We're going to invite them for coffee." The mission to hegemony space became known as the Great Coffee Diplomacy Campaign. A small fleet of voluntary participants from dozens of species traveled to the edge of hegemony territory carrying no weapons, no demands, and no official authority of any kind. They carried instead coffee makers, comfortable chairs, and an unshakable belief that any problem could be solved if people sat down together and talked it through. The first encounter set the tone for everything that followed. The hegemony battle fleet, a massive display of military precision and overwhelming force, met the human-led diplomatic mission with formal demands for surrender and submission to hegemony authority. The human response was typically direct. "Hi. There. We're not really set up for surrendering. Want to come aboard for coffee and discussion instead?" Supreme Commander Korath of the hegemony had conquered 47 star systems and never encountered a response that didn't fit into the categories of immediate surrender, futile resistance, or desperate negotiation for mercy. The concept of an invitation to coffee was so outside his experience that it took several minutes for his tactical computer to process the communication as potentially hostile. potentially friendly, or simply incomprehensible? Admiral Santos, he finally replied, using the protocols for addressing enemy commanders. You will surrender your vessels immediately and submit to hegemony processing for territorial integration. That sounds really complicated, Santos replied cheerfully. How about instead we show you how we handle territorial disputes? It involves less surrendering and more problem solving. Also, have you ever tried good coffee? The standoff continued for 3 days, during which the humans maintained their friendly invitation while the hegemony fleet maintained their demand for surrender. Finally, curiosity overcame military protocol. Supreme Commander Korath agreed to a formal diplomatic meeting, expecting the usual negotiation for terms of conquest. Instead, he found himself aboard a human ship where nothing was arranged according to military hierarchy, where crew members addressed their admiral by his first name, and where the diplomatic meeting consisted of sitting in comfortable chairs, while drinking a stimulating beverage and talking about whatever came to mind. Supreme Commander, Santos said, offering him a cup of the now famous human coffee, we understand you've built quite an impressive empire. 47 star systems is nothing to sneeze at. Korath accepted the coffee cautiously, his enhanced military instincts analyzing it for potential toxins or mind control substances. Finding none, he took a tentative sip and immediately understood why humans were so dangerously unbureaucratic. The beverage was delicious and energizing without being regulated. Our empire represents order, discipline, and efficient resource allocation, he replied, falling back on standard hegemony doctrine. Through military precision and hierarchical command structure, we have brought peace and prosperity to 47 star systems. That's amazing, Santos said, and Korath was surprised to hear genuine admiration in his voice. Managing that many star systems must require incredible organizational skills. How do you handle the complexity? For the next hour, Korath found himself explaining hegemony governance to someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding how it worked rather than simply criticizing it. Santos asked thoughtful questions about resource distribution, conflict resolution, and coordination between different species. It was the first time anyone had ever shown curiosity about hegemony methods rather than terror at hegemony power. It sounds like you solved a lot of important problems, Santos said finally. But can I ask you something? Are your people happy? The question caught Korath off guard. Happiness wasn't a metric tracked by hegemony efficiency assessments. They are productive, obedient. They fulfill their roles in service to the greater imperial structure. But are they happy? Santos persisted gently. Do they enjoy their work? Do they feel like they're contributing to something meaningful? Do they have the freedom to pursue their own interests and develop their own potential? Korath found himself struggling to answer. Hegemony citizens were fed, housed, protected, and given purposeful work. By any reasonable standard, they were well cared for. But happiness? Admiral Santos, he said carefully, happiness is inefficient. Personal desires lead to conflicts with optimal resource allocation. Individual preferences create inefficiencies in production systems. Military discipline requires subordination of personal satisfaction to collective objectives. Santos nodded thoughtfully. I can see how that would work. But Supreme Commander, can I show you something? What followed was a tour of the human ship that fundamentally challenged everything Korath thought he understood about effective organization. The crew worked without rigid hierarchy, making decisions collaboratively and adjusting their roles based on circumstances rather than predetermined assignments. There was no visible discipline enforcement, yet everyone worked enthusiastically and efficiently. Most remarkably, people seemed to actually enjoy their work. How do you maintain order without rank structure? Korath asked as he watched crew members seamlessly coordinate a complex navigation problem without anyone giving orders. How do you ensure productivity without oversight? We don't maintain order, Santos replied. We create it. When people are free to work on things they care about, when they have the authority to solve problems they encounter, when they're trusted to make good decisions, order emerges naturally. But what about conflicts? Resource allocation disputes? Competing priorities? We work them out, said Engineer Martinez, looking up from a console she was modifying while humming. When everyone's focused on solving problems instead of protecting their position in a hierarchy, most conflicts are actually pretty easy to resolve. Korath watched her work with fascination. You're modifying critical ship systems without authorization from superior officers? I'm improving critical ship systems because I know how to make them work better, Martinez corrected. Riley trusts me to make good decisions about engineering problems. I trust him to make good decisions about navigation problems. We all trust each other to be competent adults who care about doing good work. The concept was so alien to hegemony thinking that Korath felt his worldview beginning to shift. But what if you make mistakes? What if your modifications cause system failures? Then I fix them, Martinez said simply. That's what engineers do. We solve problems. We don't ask permission to solve problems. We don't blame other people when problems arise. And we don't wait for orders to start fixing things. We just solve problems. Over the following days, Korath observed human operations with the analytical precision of a military commander and the growing amazement of someone discovering that everything he thought he knew about leadership was incomplete. He watched humans resolve a complex trade dispute between 3 different species in 2 hours through collaborative problem solving, rather than the weeks of formal arbitration such disputes required in hegemony space. He observed their approach to resource allocation, which involved actually asking people what they needed instead of calculating optimal distribution through algorithmic analysis. Most remarkably, he witnessed their conflict resolution methods, which seemed to consist entirely of helping everyone involved figure out solutions that worked for everyone. Admiral Santos, he said on the 3rd day of his visit, your methods are intriguing, but surely they cannot scale to imperial management. Individual colonies, perhaps. Small groups, certainly. But complex multi-system governance requires hierarchical authority. Santos smiled the patient smile of someone who had heard this objection many times. Supreme Commander, how many people do you think are actively involved in governing your 47 star systems? Korath's tactical computer immediately provided the answer. The hegemony command structure consists of approximately 2 million. Officers across all levels of authority, supported by 15 million administrative personnel. And how many people are actively involved in governing our cooperative territories? Korath considered the question. From what he had observed, the humans had no formal governmental structure at all. I cannot determine an accurate count. You appear to have no formal government. Exactly, Santos said. Every person in our territories is involved in governing them. When everyone is responsible for solving problems, you don't need people whose only job is to give orders to the problem solvers. The revelation hit Korath like a physical blow. The hegemony had created an empire by concentrating decision-making, authority in a small number of highly trained leaders. The humans had created a civilization by distributing decision-making authority to everyone. But surely this leads to chaos? Conflicting decisions? Inefficient resource allocation? Supreme Commander, Santos said, let me ask you something. In your empire, how long does it take to solve a problem that requires coordination between multiple star systems? Korath's computer provided the standard timeframes. Complex intersystem problems are typically resolved within 6 to 8 standard months, assuming proper authorization channels and resource allocation procedures. Last month, Santos said, we had a medical emergency that required expertise from 12 different star systems and resources from 23 different colonies. We had specialists on site within 18 hours and the problem completely resolved within a week. That's impossible. Intersystem coordination requires formal request procedures, authorization from multiple command levels, resource allocation approvals. Or, Santos interrupted gently, it requires people who care about solving problems and are free to solve them without asking permission. Korath spent the remainder of his visit studying human coordination methods with the intensity of a military strategist analyzing enemy tactics. What he discovered was that the humans had achieved something the hegemony had considered impossible. They had eliminated the inefficiencies of hierarchy without losing the benefits of organization that they coordinated. Vast, complex operations through voluntary cooperation and shared information rather than command authority. They allocated resources based on need and availability rather than bureaucratic procedure. They resolved conflicts through collaborative problem-solving rather than imposed decisions. Most remarkably, they achieved all of this while maintaining the kind of flexibility and responsiveness that rigid hierarchies could never match. Admiral, he said on his final day aboard the human ship, I must ask directly. Would your methods work for a society that has known only military hierarchy for generations? Santos considered the question seriously. Supreme Commander, I think. The better question is whether your people want to try something different. If they're satisfied with how things work now, then there's no reason to change. And if they're not satisfied, then they're always welcome in our territories. No conquest required, no submission demanded. Just people helping people solve problems together. Korath returned to his fleet with a report that would change the course of hegemony history. For the first time in his military career, he recommended that the hegemony consider alternatives to conquest, not because the humans posed a military threat, but because they offered something more valuable than territory. They offered a different way of thinking about civilization itself, the hegemony. Command Authority's response was predictably hierarchical. They ordered Korath to cease contact with the humans and proceed with standard conquest procedures. They dispatched additional fleets to support the operation. They initiated protocols for integrating human territories into the hegemony command structure. But Korath had learned something during his time with the humans that no amount of military training had taught him. Orders from superior officers were only as valid as the willingness of subordinates to follow them. He opened a communication channel to all vessels in his fleet and shared his observations about human civilization. He transmitted recordings of his conversations with Santos, Martinez, and the other humans he had met. He provided detailed analysis of human coordination methods, resource allocation systems, and conflict resolution procedures. Then he asked his fleet a question that no hegemony commander had ever asked. What do you think we should do? The response was unprecedented in hegemony military history. Instead of immediately acknowledging his orders and proceeding with conquest, his officers asked questions. They wanted to know more about human methods. They wanted to understand how voluntary cooperation could be more effective than command hierarchy. They wanted to discuss whether there might be better ways to organize their society. Within hours, what had started as a military briefing had become a fleet-wide philosophical discussion about the nature of authority, the purpose of government, and the meaning of civilization. Officers who had spent their careers following orders without question began questioning everything about how their society functioned. The revolution wasn't violent or dramatic. It was simply the quiet realization that there were alternatives to the only system they had ever known. The final transmission from Supreme Commander Korath to Hegemony Central Command was brief and unprecedented. Request permission to explore alternative governance models. Fleet will remain in human space for extended cultural observation. The response from Central Command was equally brief and entirely predictable. Permission denied. Proceed with conquest immediately. Any deviation from orders will be considered. Mutiny. Korath's reply entered hegemony history as the beginning of the end of absolute military authority. With respect, Central Command, we formally decline. The hegemony civil war lasted exactly 3 days. Not because of superior military force or brilliant tactical maneuvering, but because most of the hegemony military decided they would rather explore voluntary cooperation than enforce involuntary obedience. The revolution succeeded primarily through the simple expedient of most people choosing to stop following orders they didn't agree with. The aftermath was chaotic in the most beautiful way possible. 47 star systems suddenly found themselves free to organize their societies however they chose, rather than however they were ordered. Some maintained aspects of their old hierarchical systems, but modified them to include more voluntary participation. Others adopted human-style cooperative governance wholesale. Most created hybrid systems that combined the organizational benefits of structure with the flexibility benefits of freedom. Former Supreme Commander Korath, now simply Korath, coordinator of the Voluntary Defense Alliance, often visited the HFY converted administrative nexus to share coffee and conversation with Zeftal and Santos. The three of them represented something unprecedented in galactic history. Former enforcers of authority who had learned to coordinate voluntary cooperation instead. You know, Korath said during one of these visits, I've been thinking about what makes the difference between government and governance. Oh, Santos replied, settling into his favorite chair with a fresh cup of coffee. Government is about making people do things, Korath continued. It's about authority, hierarchy, and enforcement. Governance is about helping people do things. It's about coordination, cooperation, and support. Zeftal nodded thoughtfully. For 10,000 years, we thought civilization required government. Turns out it just requires governance. The funny thing, Santos added, is that governance actually works better when it's not backed by the threat of force. When people are free to choose cooperation, they tend to cooperate more effectively than when they're forced to. Their conversation was interrupted by an alert from the communication center. The same young technician who had brought news of the hegemony situation approached with another data pad and an expression of barely suppressed excitement. Coordinators, she said, we're receiving a priority transmission from the Far Rim territories. The Eternal Empire has made contact with our settlements. The three former enforcers of authority exchanged knowing glances. Let me guess, Santos said, another ancient civilization that's confused by voluntary cooperation? Actually, the technician replied, they're not confused at all. They're terrified. Terrified? Zeftal asked. Of what? Of us, apparently. The Eternal Empire has existed for 50,000 years by maintaining perfect order through perfect control. They've never encountered a civilization that functions without control mechanisms, and they think we're some kind of chaos entity that destroys organized society through contact. Santos began to laugh, the warm sound echoing through the converted administrative center. They think we're the dangerous ones? According to their transmission, yes. They're requesting that we remain in our current territories and not spread our anarchistic influence any further into the galaxy. Korath shook his head in amazement. We've gone from being regulated by bureaucracy and conquered by military force to being feared as agents of chaos. Is there any form of authority that understands voluntary cooperation? Probably not, Zeftal replied. After all, If they understood voluntary cooperation, they wouldn't be authorities in the traditional sense. Santos stood up with the expression that had become familiar across the galaxy. Human about to solve a problem that everyone else considered unsolvable. "Well," he said, "I suppose someone should go explain to the Eternal Empire that chaos and freedom aren't the same thing." "Admiral," the technician said, "they've specifically requested that we not attempt any diplomatic contact. They consider our very presence a threat to social stability." "That's exactly why they need to meet us," Santos replied. "Besides, I bet they've never tried good coffee." As Santos began organizing another diplomatic mission, that would probably result in another ancient authority structure discovering the benefits of voluntary cooperation, Zeftal reflected on how much the galaxy had changed. 3 years ago, he had been processing permits for activities that people could perfectly well organize themselves. Now he was coordinating voluntary assistance networks that help people organize themselves better than any permit system ever could. The galaxy hadn't descended into chaos as every authority structure had predicted. Instead, it had become more organized, more efficient, more innovative, and more peaceful than it had ever been under centralized control. People, it turned out, were quite good at organizing their own lives when they were free to do so. They were even better at helping their neighbors organize their lives when helping was voluntary rather than mandated. "You know," he said to Korath as they watched Santos gather another group of volunteers for another impossible diplomatic mission, "I think we may have accidentally discovered the secret to galactic civilization." "What's that?" "Freedom isn't the opposite of order. Freedom is what makes genuine order possible." The communication alert chimed again. The technician approached with a smile that suggested good news for a change. Coordinators were receiving a transmission from the inner core worlds. The Independent Systems Alliance is requesting assistance with establishing cooperative governance protocols. More former bureaucrats discovering the benefits of voluntary cooperation? Zeftal asked. "Actually," the technician replied, "these are colonies established by people who left their home world specifically to escape authoritarian government. They've been trying to figure out how to organize themselves without recreating the authority structures they fled." Santos turned from his mission planning with renewed interest. People who already understand that they don't want to be controlled, but aren't sure how to coordinate without control? Exactly. They've heard about our successes with voluntary cooperation and want to learn our methods. For the first time since the great bureaucratic dissolution began, Zeftal felt like they were finally getting ahead of the problems instead of just responding to them. People who start with the assumption that freedom is valuable and just need help figuring out how to organize it effectively. "This," Santos said with satisfaction, "is how civilization actually spreads. Not through conquest or regulation, but through people choosing better ways to live and sharing those ways with their neighbors." As they prepared to help yet another group of people discover the benefits of voluntary cooperation, Zeftal realized that they had answered the fundamental question that had driven his entire career. How do you maintain order in a complex society? The answer, it turned out, was surprisingly simple. You don't maintain order. You create the conditions where order emerges naturally from people who are free to solve problems, help their neighbors, and organize their lives according to their own judgment and values. It wasn't the answer he had expected when he started his career in galactic administration, but it was the answer that actually worked, and across the galaxy, in millions of communities where people were finally free to organize their lives without asking permission, civilization flourished in ways that no amount of regulation, hierarchy, or control had ever achieved. Because it turned out that the secret to galactic peace wasn't controlling people. It was trusting them. The humans had known this all along, of course. They had simply been polite enough to let everyone else figure it out for themselves. Hey there, magnificent rebels of freedom. If this story of humans accidentally liberating an entire galaxy by refusing to ask permission for their existence didn't make you want to stand up and cheer for the power of human independence, I don't know what will. This tale proves something incredible about our species. We don't just ignore authority when it's wrong. We show everyone else that they don't need to ask permission to be free. Think about it. Right now, in our real world, humans are doing exactly what Captain Santos and Administrator Zeftal did. We're questioning systems that don't work. We're finding better ways to organize ourselves. We're proving that voluntary cooperation is more effective than forced compliance. We're showing that people don't need rulers. They need each other. Want to hear your rebellion stories? Drop a comment below and tell me, what's the most beautifully defiant thing you've ever done? Did you ignore a stupid rule that made no sense? Did you find a better way to solve a problem than the official method? Or did you just refuse to ask permission for something you had every right to do? Share your stories of human independence. And absolutely obliterate that like button if you believe that the most dangerous words in any language are "because I said so." Because today's story proves that when humans hear those words, we don't just rebel. We build something better. Got another mind-blowing story coming up about what happens when aliens try to study human psychology and accidentally discover why we're impossible to predict, control, or defeat. Trust me. You won't want to miss the tale of why human unpredictability became the most studied and feared phenomenon in galactic science. Until next time, remember, we don't ask for permission to be human. We just are. And that's what makes US unstoppable. See you in the next one, freedom fighters.